Jeffrey Locker had the perfect life, the perfect family, and $1 million smile. But he was worth more to his family dead than alive. Behind the expensive suits and the power of positivity lay a desperate man who spent his final hours hunting for his own killer in the darkest corners of New York City. Jeffrey Locker was a man who sold hope for a living. As a prominent motivational speaker and consultant, he traveled in elite circles, coaching executives at Fortune 500 companies like IBM and Forbes on how to manifest success and maintain a positive mindset. To the outside world, he was the personification of the American dream. He lived in a sprawling home in suburban Long Island with his wife, Chris, and their 3 children. He was known as a doting father and a pillar of his community. However, in July 2009, that polished veneer began to crack. On a humid New York evening, Locker told his family he was heading into the city for a speaking engagement. Later that night, he called his wife to tell her he had a flat tire and that a good Samaritan was helping him fix it. He promised to be home soon. He never made it. The next morning, the dream ended in a nightmare. A New York City police officer on patrol in East Harlem spotted a luxury SUV parked in a desolate area near a housing project. Inside, slumped over the steering wheel, was Jeffrey Locker. His hands were bound behind his back with a telephone cord, and his chest had been ravaged by multiple stab wounds. The interior of the car was a grisly scene of carnage. At first glance, the motive seemed obvious. A wealthy man from the suburbs had taken a wrong turn into a dangerous neighborhood and fell victim to a robbery gone wrong. His wallet was found on the seat, emptied of cash and credit cards. It was a tragedy that stoked the fears of every suburbanite who ventured into the city. But as the NYPD's elite homicide detectives began to process the scene, the robbery narrative started to fall apart. The first red flag was the vehicle itself. Despite Locker's frantic call to his wife about a flat tire, forensic technicians discovered that all 4 tires were perfectly inflated and showed no signs of damage or repair. There was no jack, no spare tire out, and no road grime on Locker's expensive clothing. He had lied to his wife about why he was stopped. Why would a successful man lie about his location? Then came the even more baffling discovery. A receipt and a bag from a local bodega showing that Locker had purchased a box of condoms just moments before his death. The investigators began to wonder if Locker was in Harlem for a secret tryst, perhaps living a double life that his family knew nothing about. Was he meeting a mistress? Was he exploring a side of himself he kept hidden in Long Island? They began canvassing the local hotels and questioning sex workers in the area. But no one recognized the man in the suit. The truth was far more clinical and cold. Detectives dug into Locker's financial records and found a black hole of debt. The motivational guru was a victim of a Lou Pullman Ponzi scheme, the same scam that had defrauded members of boy bands like NSYNC. Locker hadn't just lost his own money. He had convinced his friends, family, and clients to invest millions into the fraudulent scheme. He was facing total financial ruin, potential lawsuits, and social exile. He was a success coach who had failed on a catastrophic scale. As the walls closed in, Locker realized he had one asset left: his life insurance. He carried nearly $14 million in coverage. But there was a catch. If he committed suicide, his family would get nothing. He needed to be murdered. He didn't go to Harlem for sex. He went there to find someone desperate enough to kill him for the price of a few ATM withdrawals. He was a salesman to the end, and he was about to make the most horrifying pitch of his life. Locker's journey into the heart of darkness led him to Kenneth Minor, a man whose life was the polar opposite of a Long Island elite. Minor was a career criminal and drug user who spent his days on the streets of East Harlem. On the night of July 16th, Minor was approached by a man in a fancy car who looked completely out of place. According to Minor's later confession, Locker didn't look like a victim. He looked like a man on a mission. Locker's pitch was simple and terrifying. "I need you to help me end it." Initially, Minor thought the man was crazy or a cop, but Locker was persistent. He explained his situation with the same practiced charisma he used on corporate stages. He told Minor that he was worth more dead than alive, and that he needed his death to look like a violent robbery so his children could inherit the millions from his insurance policies. The details of their agreement were surreal. Locker first asked Minor to find him a gun, offering him $60 to procure one. Minor took the money, but, unable to find a firearm, returned to the car, expecting the man to be gone. Instead, Locker was still there, waiting. Since a gun was off the table, Locker proposed a manual solution. He had done his research, knowing that a simple stabbing might not look like a robbery if there was no struggle. He instructed Minor to hold a knife against the steering wheel, while Locker himself lunged forward, driving his own chest into the blade. It was a suicide by proxy so meticulously planned that it defied human instinct. Minor claimed that he didn't stab Locker in the traditional sense. He merely provided the resistance, while Locker did the work of ending his own life. This was Locker's final performance, a man choreographing his own slaughter to ensure his family's financial survival. Forensic evidence back at the lab began to corroborate this bizarre story. Pathologists noted that the angle of the wounds was consistent with someone leaning down onto a fixed object, rather than being attacked by someone standing over them. Furthermore, there were no defensive wounds on Locker's hands, no signs that he had tried to block the knife or fight back. He had even provided the phone cord and instructed Minor on how to bind his hands behind his back to make it look like he had been restrained by a predator. As payment, Locker gave Minor his ATM card and his PIN, telling him to wait until after the deed was done to withdraw the cash. Locker was literally paying for his own execution, using the very cards that would eventually lead the police straight to his killer. Minor's confession turned the case from a standard murder investigation into a legal and ethical quagmire. Was Minor a murderer, or was he a human suicide machine hired by a man who was the ultimate manipulator? Minor insisted he was a mercy killer who was doing Locker a favor. He recounted how Locker talked about his children and his desire to provide for them, using his motivational skills to guilt Minor into helping him. It was a twisted version of the helpfulness Locker preached in his seminars. To the police, however, the motive was irrelevant. In the eyes of the law, if you assist in a death, you are responsible for it. They tracked Minor through the ATM transactions Locker had authorized, and when they arrested him, they found a man who seemed more confused by the bizarre encounter than remorseful for a crime. The Good Samaritan Locker had lied about to his wife had turned out to be a man he hired to hold a knife to his heart. The trial of Kenneth Minor in 2011 was one of the most sensational in New York history. It forced a jury to decide, where does suicide end and murder begin? Minor's defense team leaned heavily into the suicide by proxy narrative. They argued that Jeffrey Locker was the true architect of the crime, and that Kenneth Minor was merely a tool used by a master salesman to commit insurance fraud. They portrayed Locker as a predatory suicide victim who exploited a poor, drug-addicted man to solve his financial problems. They argued that Minor didn't have the intent to kill for malice, but was essentially participating in a contract. The defense's star witness was, in a sense, the forensic evidence itself. The lack of struggle, the bound hands, and the upward trajectory of the knife wounds all pointed to Locker's active participation in his own demise. The prosecution, however, remained steadfast. They argued that a mercy killing or assisted suicide is still murder under New York law. They contended that Minor had multiple opportunities to walk away, but chose to stay for the sake of the ATM card. To them, Minor was a cold opportunist who saw a man in a mental crisis and decided to profit from it. They pointed out the sheer brutality of the act, 6 stab wounds that pierced the heart, lungs, and kidneys. They argued that no matter what Locker wanted, Minor was the one who provided the lethal force. The jury was left to grapple with the image of a successful man, so broken by greed and debt that he orchestrated a gruesome death, and a street-level criminal who became an accidental hitman. After only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury rejected the mercy argument and found Kenneth Minor guilty of second-degree murder. The aftermath of the trial revealed a final layer of irony. Locker's elaborate plan to save his family through insurance fraud failed almost completely. Insurance companies are not easily fooled, When the details of the assisted suicide and the financial motives came to light, the major insurers refused to pay out the $14 million. They argued that the death was a result of Locker's own criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. Locker's family, who had remained conspicuously absent from the courtroom throughout the trial, was left with nothing but the public shame of Jeffrey's double life and the loss of their patriarch. Kenneth Minor's conviction was later overturned on appeal and reduced to manslaughter in a plea deal, but the damage was done. Minor served years in prison for a crime that would never have happened if not for the desperate vision of a motivational speaker. Ultimately, the Jeffrey Locker case stands as a haunting reminder of the power of persuasion gone wrong. Locker spent his life telling people they could have anything they wanted if they just worked hard and stayed positive. In the end, he used those same skills to persuade a stranger to help him die. He treated his own life like a final business transaction, attempting to sell his death to an insurance company to cover up the failures of his life. It remains the most bizarre case in the history of the NYPD, a story where the victim was the villain, the killer was a contractor, and the perfect life was nothing more than a lethal illusion. Locker's legacy isn't one of success or inspiration, but a cautionary tale of how the weight of a lie can eventually crush even the most charismatic of men.